the United States has like made an extraordinarily dumb empire. The colonial rent we extract like goes only to a very small slice of Americans who benefit from the wealth effect of asset inflation. And like it actively undermines our ability to perpetuate the empire because it undermines the military industrial complex upon which it was built. And so it's not a very smart empire. And it is not a smart empire because it was built basically in an emergency as we tried to keep this thing funded amid an oil crisis.
American empire is in a very deep crisis. That much is obvious. But what's less well known is that it has very serious critics from the right. JD Vance, Tucker Carlson, many of the Americans who voted for Trump in the 2024 election. But what are they thinking now? Everyone has a game, of course, but what is it? Well, the person who knows is my guest this week, James Pogue. James is a truly exceptional reporter. He's reported on the decline of global empires from West and Central Africa, where the Russian Wagner Group picks over the corpse of France-Afrique, the French neo-colonies. He's reported from deep rural America, where secessionist movements try and break away from the state of California. And he's reported from now Washington, D.C., where the true absurdities of American empire are all contained and expressed. Of all the people I know personally, James is also the closest to JD Vance, the current US vice president, and therefore just one heartbeat away from becoming president, or an election in 2 years' time. But what makes James such an interesting and thoughtful person to talk to about this is that he knows it's not just about the people. It's also about the structure. The US empire is at the highest level a machine that makes whoever runs it, up to and including the president themselves, do what it demands of them. The number one job of the US president, including possible future President Vance, will be to keep the system going. That means juicing asset prices, keeping the stock market going up, and supporting the military-industrial complex. So can anyone truly change it? And would we actually want them to? Well, the person next in line to try is JD Vance, a man with some truly radical and frankly baffling views about America, its history, and the world that it governs. This show connects to my conversations with Alfred McCoy on the decline and fall of empires, to the conversation with Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff on the tech right and the empire of Elon Musk, to my conversation with Thea Riafrancos on extraction and state control of critical minerals. The full map is always available on the Novara Media website, and the link for that will be in the show notes. James Pogue, welcome to Your Own Research.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back.
We spoke about, a year and a half ago, just after Trump had been elected. And there are loads of things in that conversation that were fantastic, and I want to come back to some of those points we had there. You'd just done some amazing reporting for Granta about Wagner PMC, the private military security contractor. Wagner, very famous for fighting parts of the Ukraine war, and what they were doing, particularly in Africa, which is its own spiraling story that people should go back and check out that episode on Novara FM, a different podcast from this one, but on the same podcast feed. You've done an extraordinary variety of reporting since then, before then, and so on. And one thing you told me was that you were always looking for barbarianism. You were attracted to barbarian states of existence, right? And a previous guest on this show, Luke Kemp, told us, I think, very convincingly that civilization is a term of propaganda, right? And the idea that the barbarians are somehow sort of out there and uncivilized and unsophisticated and so on is a piece of propaganda, really. So first question is just like, where are you finding barbarianism now? Where are you looking for it?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's interesting because I've sort of, since we spoke, I sort of transitioned into like, or I tried, I guess. I'm not sure if it worked. I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court reporter because I, I tried to like transition into being an imperial court repor I mean, you don't get the opportunity that much anymore. And like some of my stuff from like out on the fringes and whatnot, like it just got so much attention that, I don't know, like I was sort of allowed into the world of reporting on DC without having to like compromise, I thought, what I do too much, you know? So I like came into DC and I set out to profile the Treasury Secretary and write all these politics pieces. And I kind of took on contracts at VF and the New York Times. And in a certain way, like it's been an interesting lesson because, first of all, I think I realized not that I didn't per se know how things worked, but I didn't have the like granular ability to describe them. And so I spent a lot of time going back and doing stuff like studying monetary systems and studying like the history of the handover from the British Empire to the American and this kind of stuff, like stuff that I think a lot of my peers kind of like learned in grad school when they studied with Sam Moyne and this kind of thing, if you know that kind of set of reporter. And I had just never done that. And by the time I felt like I was really like with my feet on the ground, we're at war in Iran and the empire's over, and suddenly the barbarians are like crashing the gates. So it was sort of, I've come through an interesting experience of having a lot of things I thought I knew confirmed in book sources, and also like having realized that in certain ways I was much more naive about this whole thing than I thought. Like I thought you could just explain to people that they were doing stuff wrong and they would like listen. And like it just doesn't work like that. And I think in a way, like, I'm lucky to view these things from the outside perspective, but I think I'm lucky in the sense that I didn't have the experience that Trump people had as they arrived in Washington. And, there's that Lindsey Graham quote going around right now that I think is really interesting. Less for the content of the quote than for what it reveals about the kind of person it's excited, because Lindsey Graham, who, as we spoke, just died very recently, and is, sort of one of the last great sort of like Southern boys with a country affect to come in and be brought into like the running of the imperial structure of like America as we knew it in the 1980s, And there's actually a long history of South Carolinians in particular, because the military industrial complex in that region, there's a long history of those people doing that.
Is that where Fort Bragg is, the Delta Force?
Yeah.
Or is that a different place? Yeah.
Yeah, and then shoot, I'm blanking on his name here. But there's a great Marshall Frady profile of the head of the Armed Services Committee from Charleston, who he's spent his whole life just like just loving the military, going to every military function in Congress, like just slavishly in a certain way. These guys who never joined and therefore have to be like more military than the military. So long story short, this winding answer is building up towards the fact that I'm here just maybe an hour outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. And I'm here in like what certain people might call like the center of like the American Janissary like fighter warrior Scots-Irish class, right? That's like this sort of trope of what the barbarians who were brought into to fighting our imperial wars. Like that's the great story of like Jim Webb, or in many of the MAGA people today. Like they'll explicitly talk about it in those terms. And I actually don't think that story is entirely wrong. And a lot of those people sort of showed up in Washington. A lot of these young people who thought they were going to do regime change showed up in Washington with Trump, and actually didn't realize how sticky this system is and how like really insignificant their cultural fights about wokeism are in the face of like recycling the world's assets and holding 70% of global equity value on American markets. Like, we're just not going to end that because you're mad at the left. It doesn't work like that. And a lot of people like didn't really think the Israel lobby was going to beat them. They thought they would like win online and then it was going to be over. Like, we're going to end the empire. It's America, baby, now. And that just wasn't true at all. And I know this is an incredibly winding answer, but I will get to something here. And so I thought a lot about that because Lindsey Graham, who just died, has this quote about coming to Washington and wondering who they are, who the really smart, sophisticated people who keep this thing running, who they are. And he kept looking around and never finding they, and then discovering, somewhat to his consternation, that in fact, they is just everybody who comes in and feels like running the system, right? And one person who I won't name here, but who people will know, younger guy who's like pretty involved in this stuff in this administration now, he told me almost in those exact words, like coming to Washington, and he was looking around and he said he kept wondering when the adults were going to show up because he just was like, wait, it's us. Like we're in charge now. Like, but who tells us how to do everything? You know, so he had the same experience. And I think part of what being in a system means, and part of what I have learned, is that like in the absence of adults, it is you. It's the people who, maybe even me, like come to Washington bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and they become the they. And the they that you're looking for, the thing that just keeps everything going, is in fact the system that brings all of you in and forces you to become managers of it. And then you're stuck doing the same thing over and over because there's a logic to it that's bigger than you. And I think in a certain way, all of us who have been, for whatever reason, like brought into covering or writing about or seeing or administering this thing in the last couple of years, like have had that experience.
I mean, I'm interested to hear that because, like, as you can see, we haven't told you what this is yet. You can see on your screen, and the audience will be able to see on their screen, this map that we've been making through all the different episodes of the show we've been doing, which contains all the kind of the stories and pieces and parts that we put together into what is, I will completely admit, as the author of this map, an absurd degree of sort of like spiraling detail, right? It's supposed to be a sort of conspiracy system or a sort of conspiracy map for the left, right? Whose shape is global power, right? That's the kind of the idea we're trying to get to. And of course, you can say, oh, it's all about this one person, right? It's all about, you know, let's zoom in. It's all about Donald Trump or something. But you have to appreciate that all these other parts and pieces of this system are there, and they are, you know, keeping Trump in that place on the map, right? And keeping Trump in that kind of set of systems that come way before him and sort of define how he can actually act. I'm interested in your self-described naivety, though, because I mean, as far as I understand it, you started out as an anarchist, right? Which is, in some ways, the position in politics, right, where you're supposed to be least naive. It's the position where you're supposed to be most clear-eyed about what power really is and how power really works. So, like, what was your experience of that naivety? What were you naive about, like, concretely for yourself? Not the Trump staffers and so on who discovered that they were being naive, but what were you personally being naive about when you came to Washington?
Well, a couple things. I mean, it would be better to ask my fiance this question than to ask me because it's a long list of things I'm naive about. Because of course she grew up in Washington, right? And so she, like, one thing I was naive about, and I think one thing I think a lot of people are like weirdly, like, even people who know this story are naive about it. Like, our quote unquote ruling class, our WASP ruling class, really in the post-war era, like, was a bunch of Anglophilic and absolutely sort of like mind-bogglingly, like nearly millenarian, people with a vision that they just took from, you know, the Methodists and technicians of the Raj who set up the British Empire. They really agreed to take your thing over. And like, they made such a grandiose, I don't really even know how to put it. Like, you read some, I get angry sometimes when you see like how we dealt with the Japanese in the days going up to Pearl Harbor, and it's like Cordell Hull like sort of like snidely ignoring the Japanese entreaties to try to avoid the war, because he just doesn't, he's like, no, we're gonna take this regardless. They had a sense of like their imperial destiny in a way that if you read, and everyone should, if you read Jan Morris's History of the British Empire, it's like a social history more than like it's written almost in vignettes and snippets, but it's incredible in the sense that in the way that it captures the kind of like feelings and vibes of the imperial, like the high Victorian imperial period in Britain. And like that stuff that you see kind of like cut through all of British society, or like all of British administrative society during that time, because there's a difference.
I think what's the thing that cut through?
What was cut through is like this very, very, people always talk about it as being like a Methodist or missionary sense, like the civilizing mission of our race, to use an American Anglo-Saxon line that we developed, that we like borrowed from Victorians. This idea that like the Anglo-Saxon race could, if it assumed its burden, like bring light unto the world and solve the world's problems and expand our civilization, this civilization that is the greatest civilization ever. That was something that, had always been sort of like latently in the settler mindset here in the United States, and was very latently in like a certain kind of British Protestantism. But it was never like married to, the Maxim gun and the merchant ship, and like this idea that actually you can take this now with steam power and the telegraph and actually administer the world, and like that's a job that you can choose to participate in and do. That was something that Americans like genuinely did not consider until the 1900s, and like by 1945 it was the basic like worldview of our administrative class. And so it happened very quickly, and it happened because there was a transatlantic ruling class that like made an agreement to do so, and that's not a conspiracy theory. That's in, you can read books about this handover. And I'm blanking on his name. Stephen, you'll know it. He wrote Tomorrow the World.
So it's Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy by Stephen Wertheim. Yeah.
Indeed, yes. So that's like a great primer on it. That has the like little bit, and like he looks at the papers and just gives it to you in a very like easy to digest way. But if you actually look through the subtext of any great history of the World War II era, you will see this happening.
We have this framework that we got from Alfred McCoy, maybe a friend of yours. I feel like you have kind of traipsed similar territory, about the kind of the secession of empires. So he has this framework that you can now see on the screen, which is there's a kind of form of a formation of a new empire that turns into a new form of power projection. And then you have this essential component, which is a new energy revolution. So of course, coal, oil, clean energy, perhaps in the case of China. And that allows you to form this new global order. Of course, there's loads more things that go into this: new architecture of production, a new kind of property regime in lots of cases, military power, of course. And then you get this set collection of new technologies of domination and new justifications as well. I guess that's the sort of civilizing mission that is in some ways in keeping between the British and the American empires. And then you get this question of the decline of hegemonic power. Even though the hegemonic power itself might decline, that global order persists until there is a new form of power projection that is able to organize the world underneath it. Then there's the rise of new power, new justifications, new technologies of domination, a new energy revolution, and new global order. And this sort of cycle repeats throughout history. You were saying earlier that in some ways, once you'd learned all about macroeconomics and become conversant in that very intricate and often very technical and very difficult discussion, we were heading towards the end of the American empire. I mean, you're heading towards the Iran war. We're heading towards perhaps a sort of a different Chinese order. Is it as stark as that in your frame? Do people who you're talking to in DC, do they understand it in those terms?
Well, I mean, the question is the degree to which anyone understands it, right? And so, like, you go back to this kind of like adults in the room thing. And I think, in so much as like, this is a conversation still about like how I was naive, like, I think one thing that I didn't realize had changed since the period we just discussed, this kind of like, high American thing of the WASPs starting intelligence agencies and expanding America's reach around the world, is that, you know, for better and worse, like that new version of America that emerged after 1945, and it is a new version of America. And people, I'm sorry, but people get this really wrong a lot of the time. Like the United States did not have any alliances until World War II. Like, and then all of a sudden, like Roosevelt and Churchill decided to like completely change what it meant to be American and to have us be part of this United Nations that before it was the United Nations with the headquarters on the East River was just what they called their clique of three countries that were going to design the world after World War II. And like that stuff just like was very new to people. And it brought in this kind of class of people who were in certain ways like blinded by their morality, but were guided by their morality, right? And so Roosevelt, probably the most famous example is that Roosevelt really actually just hated the colonial structure, and he kind of made it so that it was not going to be possible to do the things that Churchill wanted, which was like keep India and stuff. And like, that was not going to be possible because this new class of people, they really did. They believed in the self-determination. They still had this kind of like American thing, like you get to decide your own fate, and like you can get yourself up there. And like, to skip the rest of this history now for the moment, like what happened in the post kind of changeover of the dollar system around the early 1970s, and when this thing became more of a financial empire, like what happened is you started elevating frankly, like the slimiest people that you could find. Because the thing that this rewarded was imprudent bad behavior and hustling for capital. And like, again, all of this stuff is general. I'm not saying that there are no people blinded and guided by their morality who have been involved in running this thing since then, right? But like over time, what this empire became fundamentally was the place where 66% of global equity value is stored on our markets. And like what that has meant is that the 10% of Americans who hold assets, who make up the entire governing class, everyone in the media, everyone in politics, everyone in business, is someone in that 10%. And their experience of this thing is completely different than that of the 90% of people who do not benefit from the wealth effect of endlessly accruing asset value. And so they have no idea of what the problems are. And they're incentivized not to see the problems, because if they see them, they will be doing the thing that what's the classic cliche? Like you never can see the problem that would cause you to lose your income or whatever. Like, the famous sort of cliche about that. That's our entire governing structure. And so like now when you get in here and you try to talk about some of this stuff, like you just see successive waves of people whose entire business is to come to Washington and not solve the problem. And like what we're seeing right now in particular is tech come in and like look at every problem in America that is caused basically by like this system having become like completely financialized and unproductive and unequal and like having completely lost its like democratic and intellectual vitality, and just this sapped, weak, creaking, bloated structure fueled by cheap money. And every solution they have is like, well, we have to keep all the cheap money because that's what elevated tech in this entire system to be able to come in and run Washington now. And like, so they're going to, they're going to like rip out our entire regulatory structures so that we can start building again, instead of considering how we turned housing into an asset class, and like, it's just endless stuff like that where it's trying to keep the whole thing running by not seeing the problem. Um, and so like it's actually kind of astonishing because the more they are blinkered to the issue, the more that they come to Washington and kind of like get excited about starting a think tank to tell people how to run the thing. And that just seems to be a self-perpetuating problem to me.
I want to come on to the kind of the question of the sort of declining or changing structure of the American ruling class, because I think that is a thing that in more sort of quote unquote structural accounts we often miss out. Like it matters who is in the room, it matters who is making decisions, what they actually believe about themselves. But I want to just go back to that thing you said about Roosevelt, right? And the kind of class of people who come in after the Second World War or during the Second World War, even obviously much earlier than that actually with Roosevelt. And there's a way that you sort of suggested there that these people were both blinded by and powered by their morality, right? They had this sort of idea of themselves that was in some ways anti-colonial, right? And so when we're telling the story now of the U.S. empire, which is of course the topic right in the background of everything we're talking about here, there's almost this sense that okay, well, America was a sort of at least on the surface, or at least in ideology, an anti-colonial country that somehow became the world's largest empire, right? That somehow became the world's dominant empire. And I wonder if maybe we can go back to something you said even earlier than that. There's a feeling that people are brought in and they're like, where are the adults? Where are the adults? And the system has its own sort of logic that pushes them to do something in particular, right? But that doesn't allow them to actually exercise the kind of the real control they want to. And I sort of wonder, like, are you saying that there was like more agency for the ruling class in that period of Roosevelt, in the period of 45? Could they have done something differently? Or was there actually this sort of slower, longer turn towards America as a financial and intellectual property and military empire that was sort of inevitably coming down the track? They just didn't realize it. And so they had these different set of ideological ideas about what it was they were trying to do.
Well, yeah, arguably, like the the breakdown comes in, and you should talk to Helen Thompson about this because she'll know better than I like how to explain it. But you can also read. There's a great book. I'm gonna forget this author's name as well. Sorry, but there's a great book called The Oil Kings that gives. It gives a great picture of this stuff because it's driven really above all by just like released Nixon papers. And so it's almost like it proceeds as an archival kind of like layout of like it proceeds as like a narration of the archive of like Nixon and Kissinger, describing essentially like what we might call in some like a coming due of a lot of different things, sort of like, and we could throw into this Lyndon Johnson, snarling to the world that America can afford guns and butter. And so, doing Vietnam and his social programs and really straining things fiscally here. We built a huge industrial economy that was like really sort of like powered, by this like working middle class, like, this thing that people fantasized about back in the 1970s that now we always talk about as like this kind of myth of the post World War II boom, that like we'll never get back to because like we'll never have that kind of social contract again. And it's like, well, no, we can't get back to that because it was powered by really cheap oil that we got from Iran and like, a number of other countries, but Iran being the very specifically important one. And like, for better or worse, like this whole thing was set up to try to win the Cold War and to get rich doing so. And a lot of these guys, these kind of like industrial heartland administrators of the empire, who like, rise up. This is like the kind of like new Texas establishment, the oil men and this kind of stuff. They're doing great. These are not people driven by morality for the most part. These are people who are like pairing with the WASPs who are driven by morality. But the morality becomes like have America be a more dynamic and successful alternative to the Soviet Union, and have a few of these very key client states, wrapped into the project as well. And like, the long and short of it is that basically like the Saudis and the Iranians and everybody like screwed and played us. And like oil shot up in the 1970s and you couldn't keep the thing running. Like you couldn't, the entire industrial, like cheap middle class thing and like our military industrial complex and like everything that we had built up until then was dependent on oil at like $4 a barrel. And by 1973, it's at like 12. And the math just
It's now at
didn't
100,
work.
right?
And indeed, yeah. But like that, I mean, compare that. That $100 is actually quite cheap in comparison to what that 12 looked like to them. And this, it's a more complicated story than I'm making it, but like this really was what broke it. This is what like the American empire, such as it was, did not work like that. It didn't add up. And all of a sudden we had to figure out a way to fund this thing in a system that actually we decided wasn't going to add up, right? And that this is the beginning of what we do now with the debt financing and the recycling of Saudi assets, where instead of like us being able to pay for the oil as though we were a normal country, now we debt finance everything and the Saudis send the oil profits back into American assets so that we can keep the whole thing cycling. And that's just first of all, it is in a certain way, a more colonial way of doing things. Like in that way, in a system that is powered in that way, and you see this with Trump now. Trump is the first president, Trump and Bessent are the first people kind of like to sit at the top of this thing and be really explicit about like, we need the Saudis to recycle their oil profits back into our AI boom. And they'll just say it. Whereas before, we were not super clear about that stuff, but that is a client state or colonial relationship. I don't know how else you could describe it. We're extracting the actual asset wealth that powers the whole world, and we are bringing it back to the imperial shores. Sumatra Mitra, who's a kind of like definitely conservative, but I don't know what you would call him. I mean, he's one of these like sort of dissonant realist type people who have flooded into DC and made much hay in recent months because they've been proved right as a kind of like outsider band in our NatSec establishment recently. But Sumatra, one of his like many personal catchphrases is that the United States has like made an extraordinarily dumb empire, because if you look at the British Empire back in the day, like there's just a lot of working class guys in the north of England and the lowlands of Scotland who are getting rich off this thing, or at least like getting good jobs off it and getting a chance to go and like make something of themselves in India if they feel like it. And it's an incredible like sort of boon for a certain slice of regular British society, as was the mid-century post-war American empire for huge sections of both our public and like arguably the European public. But then this thing, like the colonial rent we extract, like goes only to a very small slice of Americans who benefit from the wealth effect of asset inflation. And like it actively undermines our ability to perpetuate the empire because it undermines the military industrial complex upon which it was built. And so it's not a very smart empire. And it is not a smart empire because it was built basically in an emergency as we tried to keep this thing funded amid an oil crisis. And to keep with the theme of naivete, I just thought it would have been set up a little smarter than that. But it wasn't.
Yeah, I guess empires are very difficult things to construct, right? You kind of they're such complex, layered beasts that it's almost impossible to design one, right? You have to make a collection of alliances that produces the
Well,
empire.
yeah, but
Like,
if
in
you
its
and I
typical
were
kind of
designing
setting.
one from scratch, we would figure it out. We'd be like, okay, so like imagine the chips on the board in 1945. We'd be like, okay, so we have
Yep.
like this much of the world's industrial capacity, this much of the world's gold. Like we would figure it out, right? The problem is that when you get to a point where it's already overstretched, and you're gonna still be 60 years deep in it now, as we are, like you're gonna be 60 years deep from a thing where you built it off the back of a global pyramid scheme. Like that's a lot harder. And like it just takes it what I've been struggling to say here is that like it makes a lot of sense that the democratic character of American society has like in many ways really kind of disappeared. Like we have I think in a way that I would not have even understood as a 22-year-old like anarchist, like we have a kind of like mass pageant of democracy every 4 years, and we have this kind of like very careful management of what people understand and see and fight about on Twitter and TV and whatever. And then we have this kind of like completely insane like pyramid scheme that people are just desperate to keep going, and like that they won't really talk about, because if you did and people started to really think and vote about it, it would create a lot of instability in something that's kind of like it's a very delicate machine that would spin apart if there got to be too much democracy involved in running it. And so on the one hand, like, wow, I was naive, and like, wow, it's infuriating. On the other hand, you kind of get it, because you're like, people would just vote to end this thing. Like, if only by accident. People would just be like, let's get out of the Middle East. And then like, then what happens to the Saudi dollars, like recycling back into AI? And then if the AI boom ends, then like, do our equity values crash? And if the equity values crash, then like, how do we fund this thing? And then the debt markets go, and then we're done, And so you're like, well, people can't vote about that. And I think I had been very naive about like realizing how delicate it was, and how much certain people who you like, the class of people who cycle from the job of Fed governor to the Goldman, something at Goldman, back to Harvard, back to being a Fed governor, those people are like, oh yeah, no, people can't vote about real stuff. And you kind of understand why they think that.
I think there was a European finance minister whose name I've now forgotten, who said something very explicitly like that in public. Said economics is too important to be left.
Yeah, there's a long roster. British technocrat, or like, sorry, Euro technocrat, really willing to say this stuff. Or like, what's the Mario Draghi thing, where it's like, we're just gonna do what we have to do. Like they just say stuff like in ways that we don't always, but yeah.
I want to come to, I mean, like, because I want to get into the details of the projects that we talked about a bit last time, which is that, there are these people, three of them are on the screen right now: Steve Bannon, JD Vance, Tucker Carlson. Right? There are these people who, and Tucker Carlson is absolutely one of those WASPs you were talking about before, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who is powered by, I think, what he genuinely regards as morality, seemingly, at least when he's a sort of political commentator and more distant from power. JD Vance, of course, US Vice President. Steve Bannon now sort of orbiting this collection of people, not exactly clear where to place him, at least to me, but you will have it better intel than I do. They have this idea, right? And these are people who are, in some ways, trying to appeal to the tradition that you were talking about earlier, when the tradition before the Second World War in American politics, where America had no alliances, where it was essentially a sort of isolationist power. It was a power that existed, on its continent, and of course people would object to this. They would say, well, what about the Philippines, right? Which is like, a place that America pretty directly colonized in the late 19th century. No?
Well, I'm going to give you an anecdote about that. Put a note on that, because I have a great story about how that illustrates the conflict you're talking about. But go on.
Tell me. Well, the question is
actually, this will help.
They are thinking about this empire very differently.
This will help ground it for people. Okay. So Robert Caro in Master of the Senate. Again, like another, like one of these crazy digressions that he has. So in Master of the Senate, I think like even before Johnson's like been introduced into the book, you're like 300 pages in. But he has the Senate debate that would set America on the course to empire. and he sets it up as this. And he does it as a 3-part, like a triptych, showing the currents that would form this empire. And the first of those currents is the one that goes back to the Americans of the Ohio River Valley, of the frontier, of the Scots-Irish thing, of the Americans from whom I and JD come, who are very susceptible to, back in the day, in End of the Myth by Greg Grandin, like he has, that book all opens with this civilizing mission of the race. It was called clearing. Like there was this kind of like, he describes it as a mania for clearing, where you're like, we're going to cut down all the forests, we're going to kill all the Indians, and there's going to be the shining city on the hill, this kind of thing. It's a very naive kind of thing that is just like built into the Americans, the kind of people I come from, right? And for people who don't know, like Vance and I are both from the Cincinnati area, and which is like literally, like Frederick Jackson Turner calls it, the crucible of this spirit, right? Anyway, so another Ohio River Valley boy, Albert Beveridge, Indiana senator, gets up in the Philippines debate and he says, we are the chosen nation. We are going to take the Philippines and pursue the civilizing mission of our race unto every end of the earth. And he gives this thundering speech and huge applause. And he's like, this is our moment to shine and bring light unto the darker nations and all of this stuff, right? The classic version of that millenarian Americanist Anglo-Saxon thing, that we're going to spread this democracy, whether you like it or not. And a Massachusetts senator gets up and says, like, well, that was quite a good speech, but we heard none of the words that are supposed to guide this nation, like right, duty, justice, and freedom. And big applause too. And people are like, wow, yeah, like what? Who are we? We're not gonna go conquer the poor Philippines. This is stupid. And Henry Cabot Lodge gets up and says, who cares about right, duty, justice, and freedom when there's a vast future of trade and wealth and power to be gained? And that decides it. And so you see the whole thing. You see right, duty, justice, and freedom trying to police the civilizing mission of the race paired to the desire for a vast future of trade, wealth, and power. And that has been the thing ever since. And so like, he kind of gives it to you in miniature because you have the Scots-Irish Janissary class paired with the Henry Cabot Lodges of the world, and that well unto the Iraq War was the thing that would always power it. And so for people who don't understand the dynamic, that's kind of that's the vibe we're describing.
Which group in American society are you describing Henry Cabot Lodge as being from?
He's the WASP. He's the great. The Cabots and the Lodges are the New England, like the absolute pinnacle of that thing. So yes.
And so we do have, but the isolationism persists, right? But you're describing this kind of Janissary class, this kind of military class, and then this kind of WASP class, somehow unified through the, quite similar to what to what Alfred McCloy was laying out. New justifications, new technologies of domination, producing the capacity for the structure of an empire, and yet isolationism, as a strand of American politics, does persist all the way through to the present day. And it's very important, of course, that you ended that history with the Iraq War, which is really this kind of culmination in some ways of that. And yet, here we are, Iran war, right? It's back, right? Like it's just there in power. When we were last talking, you were saying that there's a kind of question about whether or not anyone can present a foreign policy to Trump that will be like clear enough for him to actually understand. And it feels like he's understood it, right? And the answer is just neoconservatism. The answer is just this like exact combination you're describing. What else is there? Like, what power do these people really have if the system relies, as you very expertly laid it out, with the asset classes and the oil wealth and the AI boom and so on, which are all things that are sort of, need each other to survive. What power can the right-wing isolationism of these people have if it is not just to be a sort of a myth?
Well, so what we found, okay, so we're just spitballing here, right? Because everybody involved in this thing's got their game. and the three people, like Steve, Tucker, and JD, they've got maybe more of a game going than anybody in the whole room. And sometimes you don't
What's the
really know
game?
what the game. Well, right, you don't really know what the game is all the time. Um, so I agree with you that Tucker, above all, is like whatever you think of Tucker and whatever you think of his views. I think it is best to understand Tucker as guided by an almost like he didn't understand how naive he was, right? And like he had a similar experience to what I had, and I've talked to him about this. And now he's like a childlike innocent, like he's like a teenage boy who's like, he's like, what? You did that? Like he's mad, and he's earnestly mad. He's like unvarnished, angry, guided by righteous morality and a sense of he does like really care about like quote unquote his people, as JD would say, and he's like really really mad that their thing got screwed over. And I think I say that as a way of saying that I think like of the three of them, he has less of a game that he's playing than anyone else. Because I think his game is like pretty open and he's pretty honest about that. Then again, like he pretends in certain ways like that he's not like he pretends that like he doesn't go to the White House and like do like international deals and stuff, like which of course he does. And so there's like more going on to it than he lets on.
He also has a lot of people on his podcast talking about like giants and demons. It's like it's such a strange sort of panopticon of people.
And is he wrong? I'm not saying like there's
Giants.
a part of I didn't listen to Giants. But there's some of the stuff where he's like there's some of the stuff where like he thinks that UFOs are angels coming to warn us about the dangers of technology. And I'm like, I don't know. How do we know that's not true? So that's what I mean, though. There's a certain like kind of like childlike earnestness and innocence that he's brought onto himself. JD is almost like the exact opposite, where it's like JD used to be so naive, and he used to like think that the David Frums of the world were like out to like do right, justice, duty, and freedom in the world, and like Tucker had a lot to do with disabusing him of that notion. And I think Tucker, JD, and Bannon are three very rare people to achieve the level of power and influence that they have, who like genuinely understand American history, and so who understand a certain level of nuance, because it's not right to describe the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian tradition in American politics as solely this kind of like settler, violent, civilizing mission of the race, janissary class. It's not accurate. That's the class that produced Abraham Lincoln, and it's the class that produced, basically from the Jacksonian moment up through 1945, what you're talking about. Like it produced a very, like, it produced a class of people who this is somewhat separate than the South. This is generally people who came from the Ohio River Valley and then settled farther west, and so like they were never really involved in slavery and Jim Crow in that way, and they were, like thrift. Skepticism of undue authority, skepticism of aristocracy, skepticism of servility of any kind. They were great like tinkerers and lovers of the material world. These are the people who like realized they went too far with the conquering of a continent and like developed conservation in a way that would like never, would spread across the world and like became a model for environmental politics around the world. Like this is the same group of people. This is a group of people who's like capable of checking itself, who's like really, really, it's like morality is based around the home and the community and like the small scale. And that's the same people who did the civilizing mission of the race. It's a kind of like Jekyll and Hyde. The joke I always make is like, much like white middle American Protestants. Like there's a kind of dichotomy between like the Saturday night where you like go on a tear and like cut down lampposts and like crash your truck into like, your ex-girlfriend's house, and then like the Sunday morning where you're at church. And they have like both the dark and the light in them. And I think if you're from that society, like as JD and I am, like that's just intuitively like really obvious. And so it's really easy to like understand. And then you see people like mismanaging our nation, and like, and I don't say that, I say that kind of as like a tease, because it's like up until 1945, it was our nation. Like that's what the mythos of everything about this country was like us, this middle strand of like what now people on the right call heritage Americans. That's just what America was. The WASPs were like this ruling Puritan aristocracy over in the Northeast. And then, the South was kind of this other thing. And then basically from the Ohio River Valley off into California, largely settled by people like us, like this was an empire of us. And like we understood what we were about. And then like suddenly it became something completely different. And I think I've managed to like not kind of like lose my mind, because I'm just not mad about it. I guess I have a journalist mindset. So I'm capable of like seeing this and describing it and knowing that it happened and looking at it to some degree with a remove. JD is not capable of doing that. And it creates a very weird thing, because JD is also very, very ambitious. And so he, I would be completely honest with you. I don't know what he's trying to do right now, because my understanding of him and everything he's ever said to me up until now is that his game is like, wait until I get to be president, and then I'm going to like restore the nation we lost. Like that's how I understood how everything was going. That's how I understood like what he was doing, and that he would eat a lot of shit to do that. And he would like mask himself, and he would learn how to do the political speech, and he would learn how to say like, well, Martha, like, well, actually like the girls are eating the cats, like, because like that's what, if you look at, and he's like learned how to talk like that and to be like kind of like a fake politician, and like he's learned to grovel and be obsequious to Trump and all this stuff. But there's like this end goal where like if he could just win the presidency, then he could like bring it all back. That's kind of in a nutshell how I understood the JD project. I think when you look at the Iran war, or you look at the experience that I think a lot of people have had in the Trump administration, where they get in and they start saying like, as people have, like over and over, they say, well, now like I used to think this thing, but actually it turns out that when you're responsible for governing, like you discover that there's like a kind of responsibility that you have to hold to that like changes how you viewed things. And like, it's the same thing you hear when leftist parties get into power in Europe every once in a while. It's the same thing you hear anywhere, because this system, they're actually having the same experience. Like this entire system is run by the dollar, and everyone gets in and goes like, well, okay, it turns out that I can't do all that stuff, but like I got this far, like I would like to keep doing what I'm doing. It's pretty fun to be in power. And suddenly you change. And so I don't really know how he feels right now, in the way that I would have probably been able to tell you before the election. And then with Steve, like, it's really incredible, because Steve is like, he's not like Tucker and JD. Like, Steve doesn't really mind the empire. Steve wants the empire to like, Steve's concern is that the empire is like not working out well, as far as I understand it. And Steve arguably like may end up being the most impactful of everybody involved in all this, for whatever his game is, because he was the one who sort of like found and cultivated Scott Bessent, who, as we reorganize this dollar system, may end up being the most historically consequential person like, unless this thing just like completely collapses and the future is Chinese, like Besant, just by virtue of being the guy doing the plumbing on like whatever's coming out of this, may be the most impactful person like of all right now in the world, like literally. And, you know, Steve kind of like, he handled that. He like made that kind of work, and he got Besant into that position. And we can talk a little bit about what they're trying to do, but like what his motivations are, like on a detail level, are very obscure to me. Like I there's just a lot more going on with Steve than I think anybody would ever know, including like people around him.
Scott Bessent, of course, US Treasury Secretary, people who are not following
Indeed.
American politics at that level of detail. I want to come back to this JD Vance vision, right, of restoration, because people will hear that, and I think perhaps rightly, they'll be very scared of that vision. They will think that that means a racial restoration. That means not just a particular economic system, not just a particular foreign policy, but it means particular groups of people being excluded from the protection of the nation state. Is that true?
It's a good question. Probably. I don't mean that. I don't think that JD would necessarily see it that way. I would say in the circle of people around him, yeah, like I think that would be very much like how they see how this should go. I think they see a restoration of Heritage America, essentially, which is
White people.
well, yeah. Although actually, I mean, interestingly, that term came from like a William Howard Taft campaign poster, but it was popularized, and the person who found it was on Twitter. This guy Indian Bronson, who's like an Indian tech founder in Miami who wants America to go back to being an ethno state. So square that one if you want. But
Sorry, what term are you thinking of? Because I'm thinking of the term white people, which I think is
sorry, I was
earlier
saying Heritage America.
Heritage American, right? Yeah.
So the Heritage American term, because it's not about white people. Hold on. White people are not. No. They don't want white people.
That's how it's read, right? That is how people
Yeah,
understand
but that's completely incorrect. Hold on, that's completely incorrect. No, like the Poles have to leave. Like if in their version of this thing, like that's like the first thing they'll say. Like because what Heritage America is, like what the American ethno state is in this conception is the people like Cajuns can stay, Huguenot, they can stay. Like there's a few groups who were here before the Civil War who are like were part of this brew that became like the frontier American, that became the mix of like the ethnic people and the cultural mix and whatever. This thing that was sort of like formed in a crucible, again, as Frederick Jackson Turner said. That Heritage America does not include people who came in the Ellis Island immigration wave, according to this kind of like vision of what America we lost. And
Italians, Jews, Eastern European Jews, like the Poles, of course.
And so, interestingly enough, though, it does include Black people. And so, like Indian Bronson, the guy who popularized this term, like he will very explicitly say that Heritage America is two separate nations formed and like sort of birthed as mixed ethnicities on this continent, and they are, the people known as African Americans and the people who like a lot of people on the right today will call like frontier Americans, the people who are like formed that mix. And so it's interestingly like it's not exactly white people, and it's you'll screw up like your reading of like how a lot of these people think if you retain the impression that it's like a purely white, or like that it's a white nationalist phenomenon. it's actually like a much more kind of like nuanced and in certain ways like more dangerous kind of phenomenon, because it's not, or I don't know, dangerous. It's like an edgier thing. It's like we are a nation born of genetic admixture upon this continent. And a lot of people, even who live upon this continent, have no idea that we are a nation, have no feel for this thing, have no feel for our folkways, have no feel for our history. And so those people are a problem. And like, we need to restore the America that was run by the people who ran it forever until suddenly it was taken from us. And like, yeah, for sure, JD like thinks that. Like, if he could like hit a button and make that happen, he would definitely do that. I don't know that I think he like would go as far as like some of the people in the general intellectual world around him who are like, so like, how do we start revoking citizenship? Like, how do we do all, how do we like handle this in a society that has a civil rights regime? Like, what would JD do if he had the power of a majority in both houses of Congress and the presidency? And like, how far would he take that? Like, what would be his levers? I honestly don't know.
Well, how far? I mean, like, so what is the architecture of doing that? Because we're talking about JD Vance here because he's the person in the US administration, right, who's been least keen on the Iran war. He said, I think yesterday, I'm going to go quote here. He's talking about the Israelis. He says, I mean, the ambassador of Israel to the United States, I think is actually a really good guy. This is on Joe Rogan. Obviously, he cares about Israel first. I care about America first. But there are some people within their system we know beyond a shadow of doubt who are manipulating and trying to change American public opinion to keep the war going on indefinitely. Again, not towards any objective, but just indefinitely. Right? That is an attempt to put some sort of water between him and what his administration is functionally doing. Right? And so he is the person who is sort of rising up in the system. Although he's been defeated on this question, I don't think he wanted to go to war with Iran. And so he's becoming a kind of increasingly powerful person inside the administration because the Iran war is conspicuously doing very bad things to the American empire. And we should come on in a second to talk about exactly what those things are. But when we talk about this project of restoring heritage America, right? I mean, I just come back to the kind of the race question. Before 45, right? It's not like there's sort of black people and white people in America on equal terms. Right, like it's an apartheid state in like much of the right in the South. Right, that is explicitly it's in the laws. It's clearly not equal in the North either, but like it's it's very, very conspicuously apartheid in the South. How much of that is part of the vision, right? Like, are we talking about restoring the kind of full power relations of that era? And can you even conceivably do that in a globalized world in which America is not, like it was in 45? 7% of production.
That's interesting. I see what you mean there. No, I can't imagine that would be. Steve is actually, I think, like he has really kind of like, I think he's honest about this, and I think he really kind of like believes that there's a kind of like middle American multiracial Jacksonian coalition that has formed where like, especially like, here where I am, like, and where I am talking to you from right now, which is East Tennessee, and like where JD and I are from, like, we didn't really have immigrants. Like growing up, like there was like some, like I knew like a couple Jews, and I knew that there was like a small South Asian population that went to the University of Cincinnati. And then other than that, it was just white and black, right? And like, that kind of breeds a weirdness now when you see the America like post-Biden migration wave, where you're like, there's just something, it just doesn't look like the America. You have no context for it. Like, we didn't grow up in anything that looked like America looks today, including in Cincinnati now. It's just a much more diverse place. And there's just many more people who like don't have any sense of the folkways and like vision of the nation that like you just by default grew up believing back when like JD and I were growing up in an area like that. Now though, like I think there very much is in the wider Trumpian movement like a sense amongst like intellectuals, people who like actually have an understanding of this thing, of like how it is that in Texas, like what is like there's a lot of Hispanics who are like way more cowboy Jacksonian than like any white person in Austin. And I think like it's hard to be in politics today. Like it's hard to like do politics well today without understanding that like you're either going to be able to like keep that like American kind of like freedom loving anti aristocratic, like the core like spirit of American democracy. If you want to keep that, you're not going to be able to do that by just like having a nation of white people. And I think anyone, you know, JD's married to an Indian. Like I don't think it's going to be that. I think there are people who would love that kind of thing, like who are very much in this movement, but I don't think any of the people involved in the actual politics think that. What they would do is like only let white people immigrate, and like revoke every visa they can revoke. And a lot of things that feel and are probably like in a certain way, like very much like designed to craft a state that is ethnically white as possible and resembles as much that earlier state as possible in an ethnic sense. I don't think they have an idea of like tiered citizenship based on race. I think that's confined more to the online circles. I could be wrong about that though, like at least among some people. It's a more complicated. I'm taking a long time to answer this question because I'm trying to give people like a real picture of how this stuff works, where it's like it's not just everybody wants to do a white fascist state, and like you're gonna get things wrong if you think that, but you're also gonna get things wrong if you like discount the aspects of that kind of thing that they might embrace. And so it's a nuanced and complicated thing.
I guess the thing is that like you say, I mean, these clearly there are people sort of in the online space, right? Loads of neo-Nazis right around at the moment. They exist, right? They're not like kind of illusory. They're not like a figure of the left. I don't think that everyone on the right is a fascist. That's not my position. But I think like, you know, there is a kind of a, you know, people exist. And the logic of the last, say, 10 years is to find people who were previously impossible to touch because they were so politically toxic, becoming closer and closer to the center of power, right? So it's not a dynamic that you can exclude completely because you think that one collection of people happens not to believe that. Although I would say like the vision you've already outlined, I think is quite scary. I also find like I'm English, right?
Right.
I was very sad when we lost to Argentina the other day. Had a very sad bus home, and I feel like I would be let into this heritage American, right? Although I'm not heritage American at all. Like I don't understand what you've been describing as folkways and so on. And I would find it baffling, right? If there was a constitution of a state that was like, okay, you're English, and therefore you can come to this state that I've been to America twice in my entire life, right? Like, you know, but somehow I have got a greater connection here than the people who have lived there for hundreds of years. Yeah.
I mean, it's complicated because like Italy has bloodline citizenship. Ireland has bloodline citizenship. Like many countries have bloodline citizenship.
But they don't try and remove everyone who it doesn't conform to that.
No, yeah. I'm just saying, like, it's perhaps not as strange as it sounds, except in an American context, except in the context of like how this nation is constituted, both in a literal sense and certainly in the sense of like its ethnic makeup today. It just sounds like crazy because it's like I have no idea what the composition of American, like heritage Americans actually is. But it's really what I'm describing is really confined to the 30 to 35% of Americans who put American on their census form when asked their ethnicity. And you can look at that, you can look at a plot of that group, and it basically like it goes from Appalachia through the band of largely Scots-Irish settlement, so like through the Ozarks and then out into the broader West. But like, you know, you go and find like heritage American members of the ruling class today, and like they have no idea like what what the feel of like the old country church was, and like they can't sing any hymns, and like they don't know anything about this thing, like they know nothing about this nation, and like so it's not just foreigners who don't get it, and like I don't really know how you could restore it, like aside from and I this goes perhaps to like where we should be talking about anyway, but like a lot of like what this country like did with that group of people was take their traditions I mentioned before of like material resources and land and stuff as the basis for freedom, as the basis for the agency that made the democracy. Like this obsession with tinkering, this obsession with like physical work, like the producerism that people like critics on the left who like hate this thing will accurately describe it as like driven fundamentally by producerism. That was the thing that in the Jacksonian period like gave people their egalitarian sense, because they were like, I'm not going to work for you. Like I can go farm and like make my own life. Like what are you talking about? And so you have this like radical white egalitarianism that crashed like there's a great quote, like a great tide of Caucasian democracy. Like in the 1830s, and that really informed like the spirit of this thing. And what really gave that possibility up until basically the 1970s was the American like prowess in the material economy. And so like when the frontier closes and you can't homestead, like these boys get to build an empire. They get to build an industrial empire, and like it enriches them. And like a lot of these cowboy guys like become oil men and heartland industrialists. And like, so there's this whole strain that like you can see all the way through this thing. And I think if you were going to give a really generous reading of like how like a JD would see things, him growing up in a town that drew settlement, Middletown, Ohio, drew settlement from the backwoods independence freeholder class that was decimated for a while by the coal industry, and then moves up to Middletown and finds in the industrial economy like a way to restore their thing, like a way to like reestablish their folkways in life. Like, and that was based on productivity and industry. And so I think you do have to kind of like tie in the reindustrialize America thing, the like definancialize this system and remake it into like American dynamism. Like that actually fits in a very vague sense with like how they see you, like a project to restore their nation. And it's really important not to disentangle those two things, because they go hand in hand, or at least that was the mega pitch.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I've just come over here to the very, very far left of our map, which actually begins with the Paleolithic period.
Okay.
And I feel like, along with one of our previous guests, Luke Kemp, who writes about long durations of history, you might be one of those people who kind of wishes they were born in the Paleolithic. Like maybe there's a kind of a like it's there's a need for the outside, I think, here. Because one of the dynamics he lays out there when he's talking about the rise of civilizations is the construction, which again he treats as a term of propaganda and therefore not as a thing that's sort of necessary to be celebrated. He talks about caged land and the fact that the frontier is closed, and therefore you can't simply pick up everything, go somewhere else, farm for yourself, and so on, or hunter-gatherer for yourself, as it may be. And that's a dynamic that we think of as happening 8,000 years ago, but you're saying that it keeps going right through the American project, because there is there's vast land where candidly through the 18th and 19th centuries, even before that, the indigenous population has been genocided, right? Like, and therefore there is a large area of land. Let's come back to 1970s, right? Because I think this is the place where this kind of tensions really shift, and we get a massive transformation in what the American empire means, right? It moves from being this question of production, this question of making things concretely, working with your hands in lots of cases. And one of the things that sort of desettles that, at least in the accounts that I've been reading, so I've been reading Herman Mark Schwartz recently, is the rise of Japan and the rise of European producers who come out of the Second World War extremely poor and with their economies broadly destroyed. Because the American middle class in this period of the immediate Cold War, sorry, in the immediate post-war, are very well paid in comparison to their, their fellow workers in Europe and in Japan. It takes a while. It becomes easier to offshore production to Japan and to Europe and so on. And what this causes America to do is to sort of shift. It moves up the value chain and away from things like steel production and things that are the kind of, I want to say bread and butter, but I mean like the kind of the hardy, the clear like manufacturing work that has defined America in that post-war era. And this is how we get a new kind of empire that is defined by American financial power and a shift from using the resources of the American land, right, to not using them. And therefore we get, a whole bunch of other things that come out of that as well, perhaps environmentalism and so on. And we get kind of hollowing out of American production.
It's an important point, actually, because that did a lot to, environmentalism did a lot to divide America. I say this as someone who's like literally a professional ecologist, and like a lot of like how I was able to like sustain a writing career over the years was by working in restoration and ecology. But yeah. It did a lot to divide America because it was easy to look at this process and blame environmentalists for it. And environmentalists like kind of willingly put themselves in that position because they did kind of like in certain ways like not see the logic of the system, and they participated in a lot of the hollowing out just by blocking everything that every redneck wanted to do on the land. And that's a long story. It's a whole episode, but it's a dynamic that helped to create our left-right split here. As far as the story you're telling, I don't want to push. It's not that there's something wrong in particulars here, but like I want to push back on the idea that this was driven by high American wages, because that isn't exactly accurate. Like it's hard to like put the causality. It's hard to locate the causality. Let's put it that way, because first of all, like we deliberately allowed the shattered economies of Japan and Europe to insulate themselves and to adopt practices that like in the American free trading system, like we ourselves going back to, this is again like a British Empire thing, like this idea that like markets, like the Brits would keep their own markets free no matter what. And it was a really, really intense ideology that would occasionally cause problems down the road. We did that, but we didn't make other countries do that. And in fact, that was a shadow subsidy, or however you want to describe it. It was a way of like allowing them to rebuild, and it was done on the theory that like thus would the world in general prosper ever more, and like it would redound to the benefit of America. And that logic would extend all the way to, most importantly, to China. After the year 2000, when like China's doing like a complete Hamiltonian industrial policy program, and like developing industries like systematically, and using like all of the things that we use to develop our industry back in our early days. And like we're preaching free markets, but like our market is like a consumption market, and theirs is a production market, and the two are functionally like the same thing. They're just different aspects of the same system. And so like it was never even really free markets, first of all. Second of all, like when you talk about like the wages and the outsourcing, well, sure. I mean, I guess like you can say that like the American deindustrialization process was driven by companies like looking for cheap labor or whatever. There's much more than that, but you have to also look at the logic of the system. And so like once you have a system after the early 1970s, where you're funding, like you're bringing in profits from the world through the recycling of asset, and you're functionally like, we're buying stuff, people profit from that. So, and this is true for consumer nations across the world. We're buying stuff, people profit from that, and then we get to keep buying more stuff because they finance our debt by sending the assets back. Once you look at the logic of that system, you're like, well, everybody in this process makes more money if we drive up the contradictions. So if we have a greater deficit and we therefore like spend more beyond our means, and you produce therefore more stuff than you would otherwise be able to sell, and then you send more assets back to fund our government and to enrich our rich people, and then that sends equity values higher and we can buy more. The logic of that system is that you want to keep driving up the contradictions. And so, like, of course we outsourced everything because it was in the interest of everyone involved at that high level to make sure that happened, instead of like figuring out how to get this like highly paid skilled industrial workforce to be more productive and to come up with, you know, we talk about going up the value chain to make higher value material products. That didn't work in the logic of this system. So of course they outsourced. I don't really think that like it's a simple story of looking for cheaper labor, because you could have also like looked for better uses of the skilled labor we had here. And the system made sure that nobody wanted to do that.
But the system, I mean, you do make lots of tech. Like you do have high value tech production in America as well. Like, you know, the idea that American production needs to be brought back is sort of a illusion, because like, well, you know, the American military industrial complex continues to be like a huge employer. It continues to make extremely high tech equipment.
Right, how's that funded? But how's that funded? That because what we did was we basically, every material industry from oil to agribusiness to the defense industrial complex, like that all became stuff that was tied in with government. That was government subsidized, government organized, government managed, government consolidated. The other material stuff like was sent off to basically like, yeah, I'm not, again, the causality is hard to figure out. But if you were like an alien playing with chess pieces, you would have sent off every like non-vital, non-strategic material aspect of our economy off to somewhere else, because that raises our current account deficit. And that means that there's more assets flowing into the system and like people are getting richer. And like functionally that is what happened. I'm really skeptical of the idea that people were not doing this to some degree consciously. And, you know, my evidence for that would be that, like, you know, go back to 2004 and you can read Mark Carney talking about functionally that cycle I just described, where it's like, it's kind of like a magical money machine where you like, we get to buy more than we can afford. You get to sell more than you should be able to. And you can just like juice this thing up. And Mark Carney was like, this is insane. And so he talks about like the like bizarre nostrums or something. He's like really snide about it. And he talks about like this system that is developing where like our relationship with China becomes the kind of like ultimate logical expression of what had been building up until that point. And he says like, so in America, the interests of companies that want to invest in Asia win out over the basic interests of like its own industrial, like core material economy. And he asks, like, how is that going to last? Like, how in a democratic system, like, there's no way anyone would allow this to persist. And of course they do. And like, either you figure they allowed it to persist because they're incredibly stupid and didn't notice something that like an employee at the Central Bank of Canada noticed and thought was insane, or people were like, yeah, okay, we get the issue, but we're going to double down on this because it's working out for us. And I think there was on the part of a lot of these kind of masters of the universe, kind of like end of history people, I think there was a lot of agency in how they set it up to, you know, enrich a lot of the people around them. And, you know, it's a moral, stain to some degree, but it's also like it's a moral calculation. Like there's a certain set of people who ran this thing who like looked at it and saw that it was hollowing us out and saw that it was getting them rich and decided to keep doing it. And like that was our ruling class. And so like you have to kind of like I think give more credit to the people who are doing it and therefore be a little angrier about why it had to keep going on and why it happened. In my opinion, then people are, not than you are, but like then like the average conversation today gives them.
Herman Mark Schwartz, who I was referencing before, whose interview people should read in Phenomenal World. It's called Empire Suicide Watch. Really good, interview there. Describes this as a kind of Veblenian contradiction, right? So Thorstein Veblen, the Norwegian American economist, who is, I assume, a heritage American.
No, I mean it's funny. They probably wouldn't be the Scandinavians.
Not the Norwegians.
Yeah, well, the Scandinavians who came they came after the Civil War into the North Dakota settlement. You know, it's weird. It's weird. People
I can't keep track of your.
Wouldn't give that. Yeah.
No. So Veblen describes this contradiction that he sees inside capitalism, which is between what he describes as production and business. And production is the process of making things, right? Business is the process of making money. And you can see this sort of in a conversation we had before with Marek Pollux, who describes what he calls lift, this process whereby production processes actually start to become this, or the process of making money rather, starts to become increasingly detached from physical capital assets and labor. We have a kind of collection of companies here who seem to suggest this kind of dynamic happening within our lifetimes, within actually our recent memory in some ways. Nike, of course, is the corporation as a nexus of contract. It's a massively outsourced, distributed system where people, a single company owns a brand, intellectual property, and so on, and then distributes the production work all across the world in very, very uneven ways. Uberization is the next sort of stage of this. You get kind of on-demand labor from online platforms, but you don't own any cars. You don't own anything apart from the interface that allows you to coordinate people. Starbucks, Marek Pollux says, is basically functions like a bank because it has these bucks in the app, right? Which it has just pure float and so on. Rakuten is another example. Siemens, even the kind of 19th century kind of production machine, certainly becomes a software business that is sort of not directly connected to production. Nvidia, fantastic, massive American company, the most valuable company in the world, doesn't make its own chips, right? Like how licenses schematics to TSMC in Taiwan, OpenAI, kind of this, and so on and so on and so on and so on, right? There's a process here by which the process of making money detached itself almost entirely from the actual process of making goods that people would actually want to buy. I think it's a misunderstood kind of a theory, but I think it basically tracks what we're saying here. I'm just concerned that the political project here, which is to say we are going to restore this process, right, is a kind of illusion. And and the idea that by restoring the production process to its former state, people making material things, you would allow that would also allow you to restore a certain social structure with a certain collection of people defined by their race, their heritage, and so on. That just strikes me as a complete illusion, right? That strikes me and because it's so illusory, it strikes me as a profoundly dangerous political project, right? That is sort of explained by, and this is my final thoughts, right? Actually, a quote that I'm going to be absolutely typical here. I'm just going to quote some Marx, right? All fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All newly formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Right? And that is the process that's been happening in America for the last 50 years. And you can imagine yourself going back to something before that. You can imagine yourself resetting production relations, but this project of winding down the American empire in a peaceful way or becoming a hemispheric power and so on, these will fail.
Well, okay. So, I mean, I agree with you, but I want to, I want to give people. I think it's good for people to be realistic about like how this is going to go,
Yeah.
because one of the things I was naive about is like none of this is ever divorced from America's grand strategic interests. Like this, there's just that's like one of the big mistakes people think is that capital is in charge, and that historically, like, that's not really true. Like the people, it's not that it's not in charge more than like democracy is, sure, but really what's holding the whip hand has always been the empire. Like, and that's been true since the beginning of this thing, like even before we were an empire. Like Alexander Hamilton was holding the whip hand. Like Salmon P. Chase, like the reason we got the Gilded Age was that Salmon P. Chase like engaged in interest-free capital in order to get the railroads built and like set off a crazy boom. And like in so much as like our military and foreign interests, especially like in the kind of like post 1900 turn towards the empire, like when those are threatened, capital bows to the whip hand because otherwise capital is in trouble too, right? And like this is a state-driven project. You have to understand them as like one thing, and we're gonna industrialize. Like that's gonna happen. Like short of America, like literally just like falling apart, that's gonna happen because otherwise we're not gonna be able to keep the stock market going up, because like it takes 6.5 tons of copper to build a data center, and if you want that like asset bubble to keep going, then you have to be able to provide the material resources to like keep all these people rich and doing the thing that they're doing. And right now we don't have that. Like we don't have any smelting capacity in this country, basically. And so like if China decided to hit a button tomorrow and like end America, they could do so. Like at great cost to their own economy, but they could hit a nuclear, like an economic nuclear weapon against us, and like this whole thing would be over.
Which
And
would
like
be the restriction of the rare earths and the.
well, no, I mean that was
they
like
tried that.
wait, no, they didn't try it. They won a trade war by doing that for like 7 days, right?
Yeah.
But they could cut off everything. They could cut off, we wouldn't be able to make weapons without Chinese components. We don't have metals because we can mine the metals, but we don't have smelting capacity. We don't have, you can't. So this is where it gets complicated. If you want to industrialize, and like if you go look at Scott Bessent, like in the last week, he has said like a nation that doesn't produce these key things, these materials, and like doesn't have its own secure supply chains is not truly sovereign. And like the United States is going to want to be sovereign because we're going to want to be able to act as a global power in order to, even if it's just to preserve the wealth of the rich guys who are at the top of this system. And so they're going to come around. It may take some time, but that is what has been happening. Behind the scenes in the Trump administration, that is what has been happening. It's been a long project. And so Bessent has been going through like speech after speech after speech, like sort of revitalizing the Hamiltonian tradition in American politics. We're trying to explain to these guys, like, no, the free market is actually going to end this thing if you don't wake up. And that's basically been his project in office. The trick is that there's a couple ways of doing it. And the way that the populists imagined we would do it was that we would definancialize the system and we would elevate, it would be Main Street's turn, and we would ease the amount of liquidity in the system. We would pull back on our current account deficit. We would stop doing the stuff the Fed has been doing, which is like every time asset prices go down, you pump more liquidity in and you just keep heightening that contradiction. But then they didn't want to do that because that would have cost people money, and that would have like, might also have set off like a crisis in the markets. And like, we're in a position right now where if bonds go to like, who knows exactly the number, but if bonds go to 5% or whatever, and people start really getting worried about American solvency, it could start to spiral. And what they're afraid of is this thing where that starts to spiral, and then you have a massive capital flight. And so this whole thing, like funded by the wealth effect, like would suddenly just like the bathtub would drain really fast, right? So they're constrained. So maybe you could be sympathetic to it that they didn't even bother to try making it Main Street's turn because they realized like, oh, we could set this thing off. But what they're going to do and what they are doing now is basically using that same structure of like cheap money washing in and taking that money and going to fund the industrial projects, like, and to basically like make it a state capital partnership to ensure that like everybody gets to keep their riches from like pillaging the world that we've just done, but also like we don't have to take any pain, and then also we can like make all this material stuff. The trick is that that has to be done by state policy, because if you like talk to someone in the fertilizer business or something, you see that you can't fund a big project at a time when there's like assets are returning such incredible value. So the whole thing is, it's financialized to a degree that the only way to make it material is to use the financialization to then fund the rematerialization, which will only come to the benefit of the people who are already profiting from this thing. And so that's what we're doing basically, is we're using state policy to ensure that the data center build out keeps going, even though like it's not really super clear that like, first of all, it's not clear that we're gonna like win this fictional race that like got set up in DC by all these policy types against China to like get to AGI a month before China, and therefore like we'll like win the future. And second of all, like it's not even sure like that this infrastructure is gonna be useful in the long term, but like we are ensuring that it happens, because otherwise like we would have no growth in the economy. And that's fundamentally like a state project. That's something that is it's a military project. It's something that like Trump went off to the Gulf like immediately and like began ensuring deals that would like make all of these client states of ours like wash their money back into AI so that we'd be able to like keep this asset bubble going. And what's really scary is almost like, not that we won't industrialize, because I think in so much as this system can hold together, which whatever, we can debate another time, but it will hold together because of state policy that ensured that we did industrialize. What's scary is that like by adopting that model, we essentially formalize the incredibly unequal and alienating and frankly like just horrifyingly techno-feudal, whatever, however you want to describe it. We formalize that as our state capital project until the end of time, because then we're like completely wedded to partnership with these people and this asset wealth that we've created to keep everything going. And that honestly actually seems to be what the Trump administration has decided to do.
This is what Theoria-Frankos describes as Trumpian state capitalism in our conversation the other day. And if you want to listen to that, I recommend it. Or if you want to think more about the Gulf interests, all the sort of strategic investment in AI overriding some of the sort of other economic dynamics that we've been talking about, then Garrison Lovely is the person to think about there. James Pogue, thank you so much for doing your own research.
Thank you very much. This was fun. I really liked your questions. You really got, I think, to a good place for people to actually like kind of get what's going on that's never said. So I appreciate this.